Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. I'm going to project and see. Can you all hear me if I project like this? Yes? Here? Great. Awesome. So, my name is Jorge Amigo. I'm the head of cultural programming at the Vancouver Public Library, and I'm standing here because I programmed this panel today. And I want to start by reminding us that we are on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, who have been taking care of this land for generations. And I want to share that I'm an immigrant from Mexico, and therefore I'm a settler in these lands. So I feel a particular responsibility to continually learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world, and to do my part for decolonization in my work as a public servant, but also in my personal life. And I encourage you all to do the same. And I just wanted to quickly share that when Word Vancouver offered my team at the DPL the opportunity to program something today, I felt that it was a no-brainer to do something about climate for two reasons. First, it was the weekend where there was global climate marches all over the world, and it felt very appropriate. And the second is that we've had one of the most unprecedented summers of climate catastrophe all over the world, but also here in Canada, fires that have broken all the records. So I figured it was a good moment to talk about the climate anxieties that I think a lot of us are feeling, and to figure out what we can do to take action and have a conversation about that. So I'm very excited because we have, I think, three of the most sophisticated thinkers that I know on climate issues and on environmental issues here today. So I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then it's their show. So Arno Kopecky is an environmental journalist and author. His stories can be found in The Walrus, The Globe and Mail, The Narwhal, Alberta Views, The Tyee, Canada's National Observer, among others. And his book, his 2014 book, The Oil Man and the Sea, which was about the fight to keep oil tankers out of British Columbia's water, he was shortlisted for the 2014 Governor General's Award, and it won the Edna Stabler Award for creative nonfiction. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And his most recent book, The Environmentalist Dilemma, is in a way the inspiration for today's talk and what we're talking around today. So Anjali Appadurai is a climate justice organizer and communicator who's been working on social movements since a young age. And Anjali, if you may know, she ran as an NDP candidate in the 2021 federal election, and recently was a candidate for the BC NDP leadership race in 2022. Now, Anjali runs the Padma Center for Climate Justice, which is a project that brings together diaspora communities to build power around issues of climate and economic justice. And she is also the campaigns director at the Climate Emergency Unit. And to facilitate the conversation, I'm excited to introduce Michelle Cyca. And Michelle is a freelance journalist who is also the editor of Indigenous-led conservation coverage for The Narwhal, a contributing editor to The Walrus, and a contributing editor to Maclean's. Her essays in journalism can be found in the best publications like The Tyee, Chatelaine, The Guardian, Globe and Mail. You've probably read her work. And her literary criticism regularly appears in Quill and Choir and the Vancouver Sun. And she was also the co-publisher and editor-in-chief of SAD magazine, which won a National Magazine Award. So also, Michelle is a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6. So they're going to chat for about 45 to 50 minutes and then open it up to questions from the audience. Okay, please welcome them to the stage.
Does the baby want to come on?
Do you want to come on?
No.
Do you want to sit with her? She can sit for a minute. If you're wondering who brought their kids, it's me. Also, by a show of hands, how many people here know Jorge personally? I have a theory going that he's the unofficial mayor of Vancouver.
Shadow mayor.
All right. This is Maeve. She's going to be co-moderating. So I thought that I would start off because we just came off the climate march yesterday. And I think that's an example of people coming together in a collective way. I have another question about it later. But as we're thinking about sort of, moving to climate action, and I think a lot of people often wonder if individual actions can be meaningful or if they're, inconsequential in the face of massive global and corporate forces that have such a significant impact maybe on climate policy. I'm wondering if you can each speak to your thoughts on the significance of those individual actions, how you think they count, how we can put them together into something meaningful.
Ooh.
Whoa.
Who wants to go
Juicy
first?
questions.
Yes,
Yeah.
one of my favorite subjects. Definitely.
Oh, of course. Sorry about that. Are these microphones?
There are for the
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yes. Do you want me to
Thank you.
repeat my question?
Yes, I didn't
Yeah.
hear it at all.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So the question was, I think, for people who struggle with feeling as though individual actions maybe don't count or they're inconsequential in the face of these really massive forces that have such a greater impact on the climate and the environment, I guess, how do we contextualize the meaning of our individual actions? How do we make them feel meaningful to us as well as to the climate movement? Of course.
I have a follow-up question for the audience, is just out of curiosity and no judgment at all attached, but how many people were at the march yesterday in the room? So good, solid, almost a half or so. Cool. Maybe we can start as like, what were our impressions? Because Anjali and I were both there yesterday.
Yeah.
And for me, it was a really cool experience. I wasn't in Vancouver 4 years ago when the last time there was a big global march. And so I wasn't sure what to expect. And there was about 5,000 people or so who showed up this time. And I felt like we filled streets and blocks, and there was amazing signage and music and all ages. I went with my 7-year-old daughter. She had a blast. You know, she got to paint a placard, and it was sort of an artistic, joyous affair. And then, you know, the question is always, well, what does this accomplish? It's very difficult to quantify that, I think. But as I was saying to Anjali, I was feeling both joy from the event and sadness that it was a small fraction of what happened 4 years ago, which was 100,000 people showed up in Vancouver. And to me, you know, I was thinking this was such a brutal summer for climate events. You know, what happened? Where did that urgency go? Where, you know, what's happening to the movement? What does that say? And we can talk through that a little bit, but I don't know, what was your take on that?
Yeah, the march was really beautiful yesterday. For those of you who were there, it was the first time in a long time that this was the first in 4 years.
Yeah.
I didn't know, to me, it was a toss up as to whether it would be as big and urgent as the 2019 one. I think there were a couple of reasons for that. This has been the worst year of climate impacts by far. I mean, this was the worst wildfire season in BC's history by far, in terms of like the hectares burned, in terms of the human cost, in terms of the money spent, all of it. I do think that in 2019, we had like a laser focus for that climate discontent, and it was Kinder Morgan at the time, the TMX pipeline. That movement, that more than a decade long, largely Indigenous-led movement against that one singular pipeline, has just done such a great job of making its way into like the cultural psyche. It's done a great job of harnessing the polarizing nature of a pipeline fight, and you know, there were so many things that happened during the TMX journey where, you know, there was this whole Alberta versus BC thing where we had like protests in Alberta saying like, we're going to force this pipeline through BC. And it was just such a...
Yeah, and they were like, well, then we're not going to drink your wine.
Yeah.
If you're going to block our pipeline. And that was a hilarious fight.
Yeah, it's just so many like cultural pieces that people could hold on to. And I think this year, you know, we're coming out of the pandemic. There are just so many places where life is really hard right now, and where people's grievances have been given like various different channels, including, most troublingly, like a lot of the rhetoric of the far right, which is drawing a lot of people. It's painting a really clear picture of the world.
Yeah.
And so I'm not prescribing anything there as to why the march was not as big as 2019, but it was definitely like the frustration has not been as acutely channeled as it was
there's
in
something
2019.
about that focus. I'm not an organizer, you are, but speaking to other organizers, one thing that I had heard is that just how the pandemic sucked a lot of the sucked a lot of energy out of climate movement and organizations and individuals. It was basically impossible to gather, of course, and a lot of the organizations lost a lot of funding. And one person put it to me as, you know, activism is about momentum. And in 2019, the movement had so much momentum. There was Kinder Morgan, as you were saying. There was also Extinction Rebellion in 2018, had made all kinds of noise in London and the UK, and had got the UK to declare a climate emergency. And Greta Thunberg was, rising to fame.
Yeah.
And so there was, I think, a lot of factors combined, which in retrospect make me see 2019 as really like this high watermark. And yeah, so reflecting back on, do these individual, at what point does individual action add up to collective action and change? I also feel like for a long time, individual action has sort of been poo-pooed by climate and environmental activists, because we remember that it was BP, the big oil company, that invented the idea of a carbon footprint. And big oil and those folks would like nothing better than for us to feel like it's our personal responsibility to pollute less and recycle more, and that's how we're going to solve it. And so there's been this big collective response, I think, to say like, no, forget individual responsibility. Don't let them make you feel guilty for driving to the protest or whatever, those kinds of arguments. Like, this is a collective action problem. No individual can change legislation. Like, we have to force governments. And I totally agree with that. And I also think that there is a strong argument. Like, I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. Like, we need to, and I don't really prescribe that everybody needs to march. I have an ambivalent relationship to marches and activism myself that I'm working on actively. But I think voting is a good example of individual actions adding up to more than the sum of its parts. Like, what difference does it make if I vote? But then if all of us think that it makes a difference and we all vote, then all of a sudden, Donald Trump doesn't become president. And it's the apathy. It's when they let you think that, no, you're right, it doesn't matter. Like, don't bother. Nothing you do will matter. Yeah. That's how those guys get into office, and that's how they win, I think. Yeah. So that's my weird answer.
Thinking about 2019 as a kind of high watermark, like, I think there has been this kind of, I feel like a creeping degree of fatalism where a lot of people are feeling quite dispirited. Yeah. As you say, I agree. 2023 has been the worst year on record. I mean, a soul-crushing fact that I learned is that, the trees that are planted to kind of help offset carbon emissions, have just contributed in many ways to the record-breaking fire season that we've just seen. So there's a sense in which the mitigation measures are actually, in some ways, some of them are making the problem worse. And so I wonder, how do you sustain that movement? How do you sustain the momentum in the face of, I think, what a lot of people would say are some painful setbacks or defeats?
Yeah, that's a question for you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to pick up this question of individual actions, I think this arc that you're kind of describing of, like, us realizing that our individual actions are a drop in the bucket and systemic actions are a lot more high leverage and effective. I think that arc is actually, it's on a much shorter time scale. And I think it's really hard for folks who are working inside the movement, like you and me, I think, to realize, like, the gap between the climate movement and the public at large. And I think that is a different problem to like, why is the climate movement the way it is? That's a whole other topic. But so for a few years ago, this was, I guess, 2016, 2017, I was at West Coast Environmental Law, and I was building with the senior lawyer, Andrew Gage. He had this brilliant concept of a class action lawsuit against five of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world. And like the idea being that, 100 companies have contributed 2/3 of global emissions. And now we have sort of number crunching methodologies that can actually assign a percentage of global emissions to each of these companies. So you could say Exxon has contributed a full 14% on their own. Each of these companies has a percentage, and then you can trace that further to the amount of the proportion of climate costs that they should be paying. So if a wildfire costs BC 1.3 billion, Exxon has, corresponding 14% of that they're responsible for, et cetera. And so there's all this kind of like correlating research that can lay out a pretty strong case in court for paying a share of these costs. Anyway, so we were doing this, we were building what we hoped would be a class action lawsuit and a public campaign that would go parallel to each other. And we would go and we would have to work with local governments across the province to get their municipality to join the class. And you only need a certain proportion of the class before it like can become a lawsuit. And so my job as the campaigner, we were like a lawyer campaigner duo.
Cool.
And so I traveled across the province and I sat down with like mayors and councillors across the province, and a lot of them in very small rural communities. And I thought this would be the easiest sell ever. You know, I was like, just join this class action lawsuit. It'll be great. You're going to get a bunch of money. Local governments bear the brunt of so many of the costs of climate, not only the impacts, like leaving the impacts aside, like the wildfires and the floods, etc., but the adaptation costs. Like what happens when you need to spend a bunch of money to reinforce a riverbank or to plant a bunch of trees or to do all these various projects that adapt to ongoing climate impacts. And like that cost right now is in this legal no man's land where it falls on local governments. And so I thought this would be the easiest sell. It was not the easiest sell. The attitude that I came up against over and over again was, how could we possibly just take these companies to court? We're the ones demanding the oil. The demand is on us.
Yeah.
You know.
That's interesting. So they were like, don't
Yeah.
fight the hand that feeds. Like, we need these
Totally.
guys. These are our allies. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was very much rooted in the idea of us being responsible, like us having this collective burden of fault for the climate crisis, which is a narrative, obviously, that the fossil fuel industry has done a lot to perpetuate. Even when you go to fill up your gas and it's like, use our products responsibly. What does that mean?
It's like when you go to the bathroom at the bar and they're like, don't drink too much, but it's half price on
Yeah. I once went to the website that's on those little stickers on the gas pump. It's like Pump Talker. Has anyone gone to that website?
No.
It's a joke. It's like a blog that was last updated in like 2016.
Oh,
It's
nice.
just such a bad website. But it's on all the gas pumps. Anyway, so I'm just saying, so that arc, that was only 2017, 2018.
Right.
And so I think the arc of people realizing that, wait, maybe we are not as much to blame as the large corporations that have kept us in the dark about climate change for decades and have embedded themselves in every facet of our infrastructure and our politics and our economy. Maybe we're not to blame. And so
Right.
and
So
that-
maybe I'm describing my arc and attributing my own personal arc to the masses is what's happening.
well, that's my personal arc too.
Yeah.
And I have to like still remember that a lot of folks out there still really have a hard time going hard, putting their bodies on the line, attending a march, because there's this like residual feeling of responsibility for driving their car or for participating in a fossil fuel economy.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, and I think that's something else I wanted to get into a little bit is, you know.
Can I do this?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
There we go.
I talking circle. You know, I think there's a large contingent of people, I imagine everyone here, who agrees that the climate crisis is an urgent issue. And then there are people who are harder to bring onto that side, whether they're getting their information elsewhere or they have defensiveness about their personal habits that they don't want to, you know, interrogate, or they don't want to feel bad about. And so it's comforting to cling to a narrative that either those things don't matter or that, you know, the climate crisis isn't real and it's a hoax. It's a liberal hoax.
The liberal hoax.
Yes.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you. If you
No, I was going to ask, you know, how do we, I guess, reach across that? And what is the arc, I guess, for those people to bring them into this movement?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I wrestle with a lot is what seems to me a dissonance of how good life is at this moment in time for so many of us. And yet it's also this terrifying crisis that is bearing down on us.
For more on that,
Yes, more on that.
read Arno's book.
Yeah. That is, you know, that's sort of what inspired that book. I just spent all this time thinking, like, man, you know, my wife is a physician. She delivers babies for a living. I have a 7-year-old daughter. And this is a really good time to be a mom.
This exact moment.
This exact moment is a really good time. But, you know, infant mortality, maternal mortality was orders of magnitude higher for basically all of human history until 50, 100 years ago. In material and cultural terms, for all of the turmoil that we're going through as a society right now, we have public health care. We have a democracy. For all of its flaws, we're going to miss it when it's gone. We have, 1,000, here we are gathered comfortably under these, all of this stuff is really precious. And I think a part of the pushback, which is probably subconscious for a lot of folks, but the message that, look, we have to change everything and uproot society and stop using all this fossil fuel, people feel that the good things are under attack as well in that message. And they're like, well, we don't want to, look, we just, we're living really well right now. And, that's one of the things about the summer was, I think, the evidence of our senses is catching up rapidly now to the evidence of science. So that what seemed like abstract issues for a long time, maybe polar bears or future generations that were going to get impacted by rising seas. Now it's been, it's the smoke in our windows that I can't take my baby out because it's too smoky, or, wildfire, crazy heat waves. Like this summer was just so dramatic. I don't need to remind anyone in this room of all the things, but it was the entire northern hemisphere was under some combination of drought, heat wave, forest fire, smoke, flood. It's just crazy, and I feel like that's what we've been warning about, but it's been really hard. It's never going to be as visceral as a housing crisis unless your house is getting chased out with smoke or fire. Sorry. So I don't think I answered a question in there, but that's a thing I think about how do you bring people on board who are maybe not already, in this room and agreeing that there is an urgent crisis.
Totally. I think a huge part of that, and this is the second half of my answer to the last question, which is I totally agree with you. It's not just getting out there and blocking fossil fuel infrastructure. That's a huge part of it. But in organizing, we work with a model. There's one useful model that is helpful in understanding ways to make change. That it's called the points of intervention. I don't know if you've ever worked with them.
Yeah.
It's just a helpful little tool that talks about there being about 6 or 7 different points of intervention that you can use to take different kinds of action to affect change. It's been a while since I've used this tool, but for example, there's one of the points of intervention is the point of consumption, and that's where a good is consumed. So that would be a storefront, so a protest in front of Lululemon, for example. Then there's the point of manufacturing, I think, and that would be a factory protest or some kind of thing that interrupts the actual manufacturing of things. And then there's the point of assumption, which is a narrative kind of tactic that you would use there to challenge a prevailing assumption. That would be this whole thing of challenging this idea of individual responsibility. And there's these different points of intervention. I think the one, there's a point of imagination. And I think that is a really I think a key missing piece to this sort of dichotomy that you're working with in the book. And that is the climate movement hasn't really painted a very beautiful picture of what we're moving towards. There have been attempts to do that, but it's been a lot more about what we're moving away from and what we need to stop doing, and then this overwhelming idea that we need to change everything, which is true in a sense, but we haven't given people a sense of safety as to where we're landing on the other side of that. And different futurisms from different cultures can be an entry point for us to explore that. So I find a lot of climate solace in Afrofuturism. There's this emerging kind of Desi futurism that I've been exploring with South Asian friends and colleagues and artists. And Indigenous futurisms are such a beautiful entry point as well. And one of the most powerful moments where a turning point moment where I realized we need to tell these stories better is I was at a show, and there was a dancer from Squamish Nation. She was a very beautiful dancer. She stopped in the middle of her show and she was okay, she made us all close our eyes and do a visualization. She was imagine when these lands are, imagine when you are living here as guests and the rightful hosts of these lands are the hosts once again. she said it better than that. But she's like, imagine when Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish and Musqueam are the hosts of this land once again. And we welcome you to live here. And we invite the best of each person to contribute to our collective society. And she like painted this picture and she was like, all your needs are met. And we live in balance and in equilibrium with each other. And she like talked about a society that was built on Coast Salish values. And that was like a really key point for me where I was like, where are we telling these stories?
Yeah.
And how do we connect these 2 points of like, we have to leave a lot of things behind. We have to reduce consumption. There's no question about it. But like, what are we not getting for that? But like, what are we landing?
What are we for? Yeah. I think it's often been painted as a narrative of sacrifice and the good times are over. We're just gonna have to make do with less.
Totally, yeah.
And it's I think we have. For me, I wrestle with that too because I also like going to Mexico every once in a while for a vacation, and I like to drink coffee, and sometimes I get a to-go cup, and I don't want to feel guilty about those things. But I think there are like deep traditions, even with you don't have like everything you're saying about those futurisms is amazing. I also think that there are rich traditions in Christian culture and Islamic culture and Buddhist culture and every culture that are much less materially obsessed than our current moment. And there's rich traditions in every global culture that is much more austere and sort of celebrates spirit and music and community and it's hard to talk about those things without sounding trite and sort of we can just sing songs around the campfire, but finding ways to tell those stories that is appealing and that represents something we're pushing for instead of what we're against, and not having it just be about sacrifice and loss. That's tough, because I feel like those big oil and all of their friends and that message of consumption, they've got the sugar. They're like, oh, here's some candy. We can make money and we can live really well, and that's always going to be a hard one to fight, I think.
I think it's also just moving the entire dialogue away from the idea of consumption as both like the cause of and solution to so many of these problems. I think that we're often sold consumption-based solutions, like buying carbon offsets or buying more environmentally friendly options, bringing your own to-go cup that you had to purchase from somewhere. There's this idea, I think, that we can through consumer choices mitigate,
consume our way out of this,
instead of reorienting the framework around other kinds of models. And I mean, to the vision piece on the narwhal is a beautiful story by Ainsley Cruikshank about how the Tsleil-Waututh are working to rehabilitate Burrard Inlet as a food source, as as a place where they can safely harvest food again. And it's a really amazing story about that kind of environmental resilience and also a vision for what this place where we live could be in the future, I think, which is something that we don't see enough of what the future looks like on the other side, which includes abundance instead of, as you say, this kind of sacrificial model.
That there can be abundance of a different sort, perhaps, than what's a supermarket.
And that translates to climate policy as well, right? The policies that we actually need are ones that sort of go against the flow of commerce and unending consumption. And that's why they're often the hardest to advocate for. They're solutions like, oh my God, so many. But like even things like democratic reform, even things like citizens' assemblies, that's to me a climate solution. It's bringing things back into the hands of people, giving people a sense of purpose, a sense of investment and a stake in their communities. Like things like that go a really long way towards what you were talking about, a sense of connection and depth and something that fulfills us in a way that consumption does not. And I agree with you about sort of taking it beyond this idea of consumption itself. It is very much about the values that govern our lives and like how we interact with the economy and what we're actually placing value on.
how are you feeling these days? Are you feeling optimistic? Like where, like in your trajectory? I mean, a year ago you were in a very interesting place,
Yeah.
and here we are now. And I don't mean in your personal life, but like as you survey, like let's say the political scene of Canada, what emotion comes up?
I feel okay. I'm like perennially hopeful, but that is just because I think that has to be like an aspect of the work. You know, like I would find it. Yeah, I'm just always hopeful. I believe that change is always possible and it's always right around the corner, and we kind of have to believe that. And I think that even in recent memory, like with the pandemic, that was such a just like a visceral reminder that everything can change very, very fast. Things can change on a dime.
Yeah.
And like it just, we're always in our work trying to create the conditions for that to happen. So yeah, I'm always hopeful, and I'm always trying to like, the work of social change is so interesting. It's such a wild, like lawless place, because there are some things that you can do that are like common tactics or common strategies, but ultimately there are no rules. Anything can happen, and you never know what's going to be the spark that's going to light the fire. And so I always live with that terror and hope.
Well, that sounds a lot like journalism, actually, right? Because you never know. You're like, well, is this story going to get noticed, or and some just totally fizzle out, and some catch fire, And, it's you can get a sense, but it's often a total surprise either way.
Yeah, and it's so it's that eternal kind of, I suppose it's like gambling, but let's not use that. Let's not use that metaphor. But yeah, I feel very good, and last year was a really interesting, like, it was many things, but one of the things that was beautiful about it was almost like a testing ground. It was like a thermometer reading of like where people are at, and can I say things that I believe, and can I talk about my story of the world that I've built through movements, through working with movements, and can I just do that publicly and see what will happen? And it did, and that kind of political offering resonated in a way that I definitely didn't expect.
But you became a national news story for like weeks and months. It was amazing. And not just, through you, I feel like you were this weather vane that kickstarted this conversation about how hard can we push politics? How far can we go? How powerful is the climate movement? Like that to me almost said more than yesterday's march in many ways, because you just shook it up so much. It really, to me, made it obvious. And I have to feel that David Eby and the NDP today, they got a strong message that holy shit, this movement has legs, and it we got to pay attention to it, or it will knock us over. And that was, I don't know, it was just a really powerful thing to observe as a journalist for me, and like somebody who's watching this stuff and not really participating. It was wild. I can only imagine what it was like to be inside of that hurricane.
It's really one of those things that we had no idea how it would go, and I kind of offered myself into that space of unknowing, and I think there was a very strong reaction. It could have just been sort of like a thing that happened, and it's kind of a side story, and and that was definitely the risk. I mean, this was after 2 years of pandemic already, or 2 years of the pandemic already. We had everyone was tired. There was a real exhaustion in
sort of
movement spaces. People were just really uninspired. It was hard to organize anything. People were tired of Zoom organizing, and not a lot was happening. And I feel like the NGOs were doing this very cyclical, tired thing. Everyone was tired. And so there was a real risk. We could do this, and it could show that we have no power. And then that would really be putting our political cards on the table and showing the power structure that we're not really a threat. And instead, the opposite happened. And I think that there's so many lessons. There were definitely repercussions from that. But there were so many lessons to draw from that keep me hopeful.
And so that to me kind of brings me full circle to this weekend of climate marches that we're still in the middle of, because New York, so I don't know if you folks know, but this is a whole weekend of climate marches. The epicenter really is tomorrow in New York City, as it was 4 years ago. So they, but all over the world, there's, I think, over 500 cities are doing marches at various times, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Tomorrow's the big one in New York City, going into a week of climate summits at the United Nations. And so the thing that I was thinking and wondering about, and I don't know the answer, but like that, what you just described, like if it fizzles, it's almost worse to do it and have it fizzle than to not do it at all. In my view, I don't know. Versus, and I could be totally wrong about that, but to me, there's a risk that if I was a politician and I see this march that is kind of lame and not a big deal, I'm like, well, no threat there. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Versus if, hundreds and thousands or millions of people come into the street, I'm going to be like, okay, there's a threat. Or conversely, I can go out on a limb here and really push some hardcore legislation, and people will actually vote for me. It's not going to be the end of my term.
Well, I think that maybe that brings us back to kind of a theme of this panel, which is how do we share those stories, right? How do we connect the actions, whether they're marches or their campaigns, to the outcomes, which is, the change that you affected in terms of the NDP, adopting many slightly more progressive positions on climate, I think. And how do we make sure that we're telling those stories in order to, bolster that hope or alleviate some of that fatigue that we've identified, which I think is partly a symptom of hearing so many dispiriting stories, or maybe not seeing the progress, not seeing the contribution of our actions paying off in the direction we'd like it to go. So I don't know, where do you think we could be telling those? This is a good question for you, Arno, as a storyteller.
Yeah.
How do we tell these stories in a compelling way? How do we seed people with hope without sugarcoating the reality of the situation we're in, which I think is something you grapple with in depth in your book, which people should pick up.
You're just the best moderator.
I'm going to keep holding up my copy.
Thank you. 10 copies are available for sale. No, that is the question. I wish I had a pat answer for it. I can say that when somebody like Anjali Appadurai runs for leadership of the party and comes really close, like that is just such an amazing story, and there's so much drama that I can write about that. Like that was, for me, that's how I met Anjali. I interviewed her while she was running, and then I wrote another story right after the spectacular end of that campaign, which was not a defeat at all, I don't think. I think it was a success in a lot of wild ways. But it was such a great story that I was able to attach a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here to it. And I think as a journalist and a writer and a storyteller, and you can relate to this too, of course, I wish I had a book of yours that I could hold up, but
one doesn't exist. This author badge is a lie.
One day soon. I think we're just always looking for these narratives, these stories that capture that, and you need a compelling character for that story. You need some conflict, and you need some drama and high stakes, and like that leadership campaign captured it all. And so I know when the couple stories that I wrote, and other people too, like a lot of people were reading those stories, and it got a lot of people thinking about these bigger issues. So I think seeking those stories out and finding people like you, and there are some out there who are doing really exciting things and who speak really well, and that's what I'm always looking for, and sometimes it works.
I have to put in a little plug for Arno here, because you're being very humble as usual. But you tell the big dramatic stories very beautifully. But this book, what I loved about it was that you find the story in the daily parts of your life. And I loved how you how throughout the book you speak about your daughter. Mm-hmm. And like the small vignettes of parenting that you then just like explode into this big sort of exploration of a concept. And so like the simple act of like taking your child to Disneyland, or like watching your child explore the world, and how that brings up this direct tension of like, what does it mean to live well in this moment in the climate crisis? And I think we actually, this summer, I was disappointed. I've been really disappointed in climate coverage in Canada for the last decade, and I've had many arguments with many journalists about this. I think there are a lot of missing pieces and a lot of missing analysis. And one of this summer, unprecedented wildfire season, we had very good coverage, I think, keeping people abreast of the safety situation, of the actual fires, where they were, what the damage was. And then we had some very loud voices being like, this is climate change, everybody, this is climate change in action. And then we had some other very loud voices being like, this is arson. This is all just arson. People
Lasers
are lighting
from drones.
Yeah, totally.
Who's lighting these fires?
Totally. And then there was like this missing sort of piece of like, okay, yes, it's climate. Let's explore that further. What does that mean? What are the implications? What are the policy implications? What does the rebuilding look like? What do we need going forward? What does this mean? And I find that, you're just really good at that. So I just wanted to lift that for a moment.
I appreciate that. If anybody wants to read about my journey to Disneyland, it was hell on earth for me and paradise for my daughter, which I think captures the whole vibe of how I see the world these days. It's like what some people see as perfect and wonderful is what other people see as awful. And how do we sort of bridge these competing visions of where we want to go without being totally torn to pieces. And that's we're not the first society. This is not the first time in history that that's happened. I feel really grateful that we're not at war. I think that's, my parents were born in Germany in the Sudetenland, right as World War II was starting, and so they are products of war. And I feel like the story of their generation and most generations before was a story of war and actual tyranny and hardcore oppression, and so I feel really grateful to have grown up in a time of relative peace and plenty. And I know that there are lots of big exceptions to that experience in Canada with First Nations and others, but still, I think it characterizes a pretty big chunk of Western, European and North American society, that we grew up without war. And so at the same time, I think it's hard for us to appreciate how fragile all of this is that we have, and that it's almost impossible to imagine that it could slip away, and how easily it can slip away. Like you were talking about this as sort of a failure, a crisis of imagination. You were thinking of it in positive terms of how good life could be, which I think is essential. I also think it's important for people to realize, like, to leave this country maybe and see that it can slip away, or to get a good grasp on history, and to realize how tenuous a lot of this stuff that we've built as a society is. And as we start to, more and more recklessly grapple with one another and fight and lob these rhetorical bombs, especially those in office, that's what really makes me nervous. It feels like people are driving a car and they forget it can crash.
I think that's the central challenge, I think, and the central responsibility of storytellers and campaigners is to help people imagine an alternate vision for the future, which can be scaring them into reminding them how fragile our the good things that are going well, those are fragile too, but also painting, I think, a hopeful vision of what could be in the future, because it is genuinely a challenge to imagine anything being different. I think that's a cause of a lot of the despair, and the challenge in the movement is sustaining that, in the face of what feels like stasis. And so I think you both offer very compelling ways to do that. I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I'm wondering if anybody,
what's in your political future?
Political future.
Third time's the charm?
No. Thank you. I am really, right now, I've had a wonderful year of really being able to take a step back and look at the state of our movements. I have the immense privilege of having a job that allows me to take a bit of a bird's eye view. And because our project, the Climate Emergency Unit, is national. And so I'm able to just work with different groups within the movement and sort of do more high level strategy. And so that's been really interesting, is sort of like helping revitalize our climate movement after this kind of slump that we've been in, and drawing in, as I said, some of the lessons from last year. I think that where my heart is really right now is in activating and mobilizing diasporic communities, because the climate movement needs a reconfiguration. And I think that is well underway. And I'm sort of looking into South Asian networks and communities where I come from and where I feel a lot of solidarity and loyalty, and going in and trying to bring some climate literacy and some strategic mobilizing opportunity into those communities. So I'm working in South Asian networks right now. I'm working a little bit at the federal level. I think that federal politics is a really interesting puzzle challenge right now, and I'm sort of working to understand the forces at play and what I can do. Not to drop a huge bummer on this group, but I don't know if folks have seen the recent polling, which shows
Very dispiriting.
Yeah. Conservatives have a head and shoulders lead right now, and that is the first time in my lifetime that's happened for especially like the younger age groups.
Yeah, that's what I remember. We talked about that a year ago too already. That youth were really like rallying behind conservatives more than anybody else.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a degree to which the federal Conservative Party is doing a good job of harnessing people's kind of rage and despair.
Yes.
And I think, it's a fair criticism of the left that there's not often a lot of sort of bridge building or inclusive storytelling that brings people in. I think people can feel shamed and excluded for failing to be perfect.
Yeah.
Whereas, I think it's a rallying cry of the Conservative Party often that like the way you live is fine, your values are fine, you don't have to change, and we're going to protect that status quo for
Unless
you.
you're gay.
Unless you're gay. Yeah. And with that, any other questions? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can hear you.
This will take me a minute to articulate, so bear with me. But Arno, when you asked at first, why did people show up to the march? To be honest, I felt my hapless come out of bed. Because I felt like, hey man, it was Friday afternoon. People have to work. And not everybody has the luxury of doing a personal climate strike on a Friday afternoon.
Totally.
And so this got me thinking, like, why are we not recognizing the economic implications of the climate movement? That even myself, I'm fine. There is no way I can afford an electric car, right? Like, have we seen the prices of electric cars? It's insane. But then when Michelle said we have to get out of this consumption framework, that the answer to the consumption problem is consuming more, I thought, like, yes, of course, I'm stuck in this consumption framework. How do I consume better? But what I'm worried about is if we take ourselves out of the consumption framework, how are we addressing the deep, deep inequality we're seeing? How do we bring everybody along when we know that we still live in oppressive capitalism? So, I'd love to hear you speak about that.
It's a really
Love
easy
this
question to
question.
answer. Thanks, Elisa.
Just a simple little question.
No, it's a great
It's a
question.
great question. Thank you. Do you want to? I can.
I'll take a stab. First of all, I definitely want to. I think I prefaced it, but I do not. That was my concern with yesterday's march too. That a Friday afternoon, a lot of people can't make it. So there's zero aspersions cast on those who cannot. I want to open with that. I'm going to leave it to you. I think I just wanted to say that and let you answer that question.
Arno just want to apologize.
Yeah, I just want to apologize like a good Canadian.
He doesn't have an answer.
I did not mean to blame anyone. Yeah.
Well, I think this is such a good question because one failure of the climate movement that I want us to turn around is we have to equate climate action with action on inequality. I didn't say that very well, but the only way we win on climate is by recognizing that all the other fights for social and economic justice are our pathway to a climate just future. And so inequality is global capitalism requires a certain level of inequality. It requires that gap between the rich and the poor. It requires an increasing and accelerating wealth polarization to survive and to thrive and to create the conditions for endless growth, and for the expansion of the economy. And so that growing inequality has clear winners and clear losers. And so it's something that we have to recognize as a climate movement is critical to fight against if we're going to win on climate. I often turn back to, I work at the Climate Emergency Unit, and one of the stories that we work with is the World War II story. Actually, the whole project is kind of premised on the World War II story and talking about the mobilization during World War II and how we can draw lessons from that in terms of how the wartime programs, like there were a lot of social programs that came out after the war. One of the key promises of the wartime was that the society that people would be returning to after the war would be a safer and fairer and more equitable and just society than the pre-war society was. And that was a really key promise to Canadians that were putting their lives on the line, that were severely limited in terms of their lives at the time. And to ask an entire society to sort of throw in to this like massive wartime mobilization, there had to be that key promise that things would be fairer and that they would have a chance at equality on the other side. And so then there were real policies that came out of that. There was an excess profits tax that taxed corporations up to 100% on excess profits after a certain point. There were price controls. There were wage floors. There were all kinds of policies that kept inequality to a minimum. And we actually see that in economies where inequality has been kept lower, climate action is actually bolder. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. But you're able to take bolder climate action in a society and an economy where inequality has been controlled, because people feel that they're actually going to be taken care of on the other side of that. People feel a certain sense of trust and social solidarity that the world that we're trying to create through climate action is going to be one that they can actually live and thrive in. And so talking about inequality, talking about economic justice, or let's just call it affordability and equality, is critical to winning on climate. Unfortunately, I think that that's what the right is actually doing really well, is talking about the average person and the price of groceries and the price of life, and telling a very clear story of the world that is rooted in there's a lot of lies in that story.
But it's a good story.
But it's a good story.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a great question.
I have to. Sorry. Did you have a?
I was going to say, I think that's actually a really compelling model for how, part of Elise's question, how do we get away from this thinking of consumption of choices, is stopping to police, did you come to this march? Like, did you bring your own cup to the coffee shop? And imagining the world that we want to build and what it looks like and how we get there together, which I think takes us a little bit further in terms of thinking about the horizon of our choices or our individual actions.
So true. So
And
well said.
we have time for about one more question, I think. You had your hand up.
All right. First of all, thanks to all three of you for the work that you're doing. And maybe this is the, kind of follow-up to the questions that's been asked. I'm interested in the, I guess sort of like dialogue with the other side, so to speak. Like I was curious about what happened with the conversation that you had, Anjali, with the small town mayors, right? When they said, we can't, be attacking all this oil company because it's like they feed us. Where did that conversation go? Because and generally about these kind of like cross and divide sort of dialogue, they're everywhere. The divide is in through families.
Yes.
People have family members on the other side, so to speak, right? And this in terms of I remember being disappointed actually in the 2019 climate march. It was a great march, but a couple of years later there was an election, and the parties that had the strongest climate policies did not win. Right, so it's there's these our neighbors, our siblings that are on the other side? Like, what's the?
No,
Are there
that's a
dialogues
great
there?
question.
Where are we going? In terms
question.
of like engaging the other side.
We could do a whole other event on that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. How to
could-
talk to the other side. That's it. Totally.
There's some really interesting work happening right now that's starting to just take off, and it's deep canvassing for the climate. And I don't know if folks remember when Trump was in office, and everyone was shocked that
I
he had
remember.
not that part, but like people starting to like reeling from the shock of his election and trying to understand who voted for this person and what do they care about. And going into it was a lot of rural towns. It was a lot of working class or agrarian or remote. What?
I just like agrarian for describing people in small town USA.
Yeah, I don't know. That was probably not the right word, but
No,
you know, yeah, just like very like remote white working class neighborhoods and industrial towns, and speaking with folks there and recognizing what had driven them to vote for Trump, and it was a lot of the same grievances that you mentioned that we've been talking about. It was feeling frustrated with how the system had failed them. They had fallen through the cracks of the system. They'd done everything right. They'd worked hard. They had participated in the society that was essentially promised to their ancestors as settlers on this land, and it had not paid off. They were poor and they were struggling to make ends meet. And there was there are many different places where those grievances went. A lot of it went to racism. A lot of it went to hate, and it was all just a big terrible soup that resulted in Donald Trump being president. And so there were folks who tried to do deep canvassing before the next election, the 2020 election. Was it 2020? Oh my God, yes. Thank you.
feels like just yesterday.
All right. So deep canvassing is when you go and you have a long form conversation with someone. It's not a political door knocking exercise where you spend max 10 minutes at the door. It's like you're sitting with people, you're listening, you're starting with listening. And that actually proved to be incredibly effective. I've experienced this myself in various political arenas. I've had, in the 2 times that I've run for office, I've experienced the power of listening to people and meeting them where they're at. I've had some just wild experiences. This is such an interesting phenomena that we're dealing with on a really large scale right now. I've had people come up to me like yelling and saying that everything I believed in was a lie and a fraud, and I'm buying into something that's going to bring the country down, and that it, they were just like really, really mad. And then 15 minutes later, we're friends and they're volunteering on the campaign. Like literally stories like that, because there's just so much pent up grievance that has not been given a place to land, a place to express itself. And people want to be heard.
Yeah.
People want to be heard and listened to.
But
Sorry,
I'm going so no,
long.
it's great. I think that you gave Arno such a nice shout out, and I want to give you credit, Anjali, because I think we often talk about, how do we reach people who are voting for the political party that we're not aligned with, say. And I think it misses the fact that there's an enormous segment of this country that does not vote at all.
Yes.
Whether because they feel disempowered from our electoral system, because they're not reached by campaigns, because they don't feel spoken to by candidates. And I think what was really remarkable about your candidacy is you engaged a huge segment of people who didn't feel represented, who were signing up for the first time as NDP party members because they believed in the vision that you were offering. And I think that can be a potent reframing too, is, I think you're speaking to a really real issue, which is the divide in families and in communities. Yeah. But it's also, how do we bring more people in? How do we stop thinking of it as this push-pull between a few defined groups and look outward to bring more people in, which I think is something you did really well.
Thank you.
We are at time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
It's really fun.
Wonderful.